There are fairies on the farm.
My novel, The Ghost of Nothing, is now an award winner, so if you like this channel, I know you'll like it, so be sure to check it out. It's available at bookstores and on audio. I don't know how much or even if I want you to narrate this story on your channel, but here's what I'm willing to share in case it intrigues you. This story is of a real experience of mine in the woods just north of Cincinnati, Ohio, back in the summer of the year 1998. To start this story off, I'll give you all some brief background info and some context. This encounter took place shortly after my 6th birthday. So, without going into too much detail, I am not my dad's biological child. My mom had 3 kids, me, my brother, and my sister, and I'm actually the middle child, with both of my half-siblings, my older brother and younger sister, being my dad's actual biological offspring. So, yeah, my childhood was very different than most people's. A whole lot was going on that was beyond my ability to fully grasp. My parents used to argue a lot, and like any child would, I looked for an escape from it all. That place of safety for me was in the woods out back behind our house. Like I said, I was only 6 at the time, and it never occurred to me at that age that the woods could be dangerous. And considering the mess at home, along with 2 other children to look out for, neither of my parents were necessarily capable of keeping an eye out for me. So, on one particularly hot summer day in '98, I slipped out from under my parents' gaze as they went at it again to go off on my own. My siblings stayed behind and didn't follow me. They both knew, like I did, that Mom and Dad would be super angry if they knew any one of us had run off into the woods alone, but I didn't care, at least not that day anyway. I still remember being that young and feeling angry, frustrated, and sad about just how unfair everything felt at the time. That particular day, it felt like my parents had been yelling at me as much as they were yelling at each other, despite neither of them having so much as glanced in my direction. So I ran into the woods for as long and as far as my little legs could carry me. I don't know how far I managed to get, but I do remember realizing I was lost. Under normal circumstances, this would have been terrifying, but I was still so emotionally overwhelmed that all I could think about was finding a nice soft spot to take a nap. After a bit of looking around, I spotted a rather odd-looking tree. I don't remember what specifically about the tree I thought was odd. I just remember feeling there was something off about it. But I shook off this feeling, hopped on over to it, sat between its gnarled roots, and curled up for a nap. I don't know how long I was asleep. I just know that when I woke up, the entire forest was completely silent. Dead silent. Like someone had hit the mute button on real life. Bright daylight was still streaming through the tops of the trees, but I wasn't sitting in the gnarled roots of the old tree anymore. Instead, I realized I was sitting on a pair of massive green feet. The next thing I knew, I felt 2 huge hands wrap around my midsection just underneath my arms and raise me up, up, up into the air until I was eye level with a thing. Something not human. I'm reluctant to use words like creature or animal because I got the distinct impression that I was looking at another person, albeit a non-human person. It was bald all over, covered in bright green scales, and had large, hard-looking, rounded, bump-like protrusions across its face, almost like the spines, spikes, and horns of some reptile species. Its face was shaped way differently than a typical human's, but was still somehow very recognizable as human-like, if that makes sense at all. This definitely wasn't an animal. For one thing, it stood and walked completely upright, not down or crouched over on all fours. It had arms and hands, though it notably had claws at the tips of its fingers. It also had a long tail that dragged on the ground. But the thing that stood out to me the most was its big, highly decorative yellow eyes that almost glowed as they reflected the golden color of the afternoon sun. That I will never forget so long as I live. I was frozen stiff, unsure if what I was seeing was even real. Then I felt it breathe on me, and I was certain it was real. 6-year-old me decided this was proof. I was fully awake and alert, and this was definitely happening. I could feel the adrenaline in my blood start to ramp up. But then I thought, if it had wanted to hurt me, it could have done so already. And this thought prevented me from going into a full-on panic. We were on the move, or it was on the move, I should say. This person, or whatever, then held me against its chest securely with one arm as it strode with incredible ease through the forest. I wasn't really questioning anything at that moment so much as just going along with the ride. Eventually, I started to feel so comfortable, I semi-dozed off. The next thing I remember, this person set me down in a small wildflower patch. It placed me on the ground in a sitting position and then backed away slowly until it disappeared back into the forest. I sat there in the flower patch a while before looking around and realizing I could see the backside of my family's house. I wasn't at all far from home. I got up and ran back to the house. Inside, my parents were oddly quiet and calm. I fully expected them to be angry at me for running off into the woods, but they didn't bring it up. My siblings were playing upstairs as if nothing had happened. From that day on, something changed in my house. My parents never fought in front of me or my siblings again, and they acted really strange around me after that, like they were afraid of upsetting me or something. My siblings and I remember the rest of the year and a half that we lived in that house as some of the best times of our childhood. We had so many adventures in those woods together. But after my dad's contract at his job came to an end, we had to move back to Texas. And after my family moved out of that house and out of the state of Ohio, things slowly went back to the way they were before the experience. I remember Mom and Dad acted relieved the day we had to move, even as all the three of us kids made it pretty clear we were sad at having to leave that place. I don't know if what I encountered that day was a fairy or not, but I've never forgotten about it. I sometimes daydream about going back and visiting that old family house, even after all these years, if for no other reason than to take a trip through those woods again. I wonder if that potential fairy would still be there or recognize me now, given how much I've changed since then. I've considered that this might have just been a weirdly vivid dream, but it all felt so real at the time, and if I'm being honest, it still feels real to this day, and I'm convinced that it really happened. This happened when I was 12 in 2012. I was one of those Renaissance fair kids who read different series like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. I also got into fairies and folklore. At age 11, I became interested in Wicca. The adults around me encouraged my interest. One science teacher who practiced herself gave me tips about the veiled world, and my dad also gave me a few of his books to read. But when I would go to middle school, there were these 3 kids who would get bothered by my interest and said they wanted to save my soul. And soon after, they started bullying me about it. There was one girl and 2 guys. They would harass me about getting baptized, rip my Wiccan books out of my hands and throw them in the street, that kind of thing. One day during this time, my mom took me to a science museum in Kansas. At lunch, we were sitting at the cafeteria eating by a big window with a view of a pond and a grove of trees. As I was gazing out the window, thinking about the 3 bullies and how I wished they would leave me alone, I noticed something crawling on the glass. It was a beetle, which wasn't unusual, but what was unusual was this beetle was wearing a bow tie. Then the beetle tapped on the glass, pointed at me, and then down at the water. I grabbed my mother by the arm to show this to her, but by the time she turned her head, the beetle had vanished. A couple of days later, on a trip to the bookstore, I found a book on the fairy world and flipped through it. My fingers automatically stopped on a page with an illustration of a young man wearing a bow tie. There was a small beetle on his shoulder. I couldn't believe it. I knew I had to have this book. I begged my mom to buy it for me, but she wouldn't, and I was forced to put the book back on the shelf. I wish I could remember what the title was, but I can't, and I was never able to find that book in the bookstore again after that day. Anyway, I thought the situation was very weird, and I was shaken to say the least. But what followed was even weirder. The girl who had been bullying me started to have a string of bad luck. She would trip all the time, her books would have pages ripped out of them, and she kept complaining about a buzzing noise in the science room, which only she could hear. She stopped bullying me after that, and so did the 2 boys. One of them got sick with a fever, and after he got better, kept to himself, and seemed to have issues after that making friends. The other boy got really gaunt and tired. I overheard him one day complaining that he couldn't sleep because some type of loud bug was in his room. It would make noise, but he could never find it. And he was even having bad dreams about it. That day when I was at the science center staring out the window, I had been in a kind of trance. The sun through the trees and on the water had looked so beautiful and peaceful, and I remember I was thinking about those 3 bullies and how I wished they would leave me alone. That's when I saw the beetle. Is it possible I met some type of fairy who decided to enact a form of fairy justice on my behalf? If so, I really didn't mean for anything bad to happen to those 3. I just wanted them to stop bothering me. I don't know whatever happened to them after middle school, and now all these years later, I sometimes wonder about them. I can only hope that fairy isn't still tormenting them to this day. From what I've read, fairy justice can be a terrible thing. Like most kids, I grew up with Tinkerbell and Barbie Fairytopia style of fairies. It wasn't until I grew older and dove deeper into the old traditions of Celtic lore that I discovered fairies weren't all sugar and rainbows. But this actually made them a lot cooler in my eyes, similarly to when I first learned about the biblically accurate angels. I became engrossed in Fae folklore, but was always cautious about where I looked up information. I typically avoided anything to do with paganism and Wiccans who claimed to have purposely contacted the Fae. I'm a devout Catholic and still hold firmly to the notion that messing with things of the supernatural realm is like poking a sleeping lion with a stick while saying, "Don't worry, I know how to handle cats." But still, I wanted to know more. I dove into other cultural folklore and discovered the jinn from Middle Eastern lore, which had some distant similarities with the Fae of Europe. In Middle Eastern folklore, the jinn can have a religion and can even convert to different religions like humans do. So I started to wonder if it was possible for fairies to convert as well. Of course, this was probably just wishful thinking. I've read that fairies were never particularly fond of churches and resented Christianity. Still, a small part of me dared to hope. One afternoon, as I was driving home from a doctor's appointment, I saw something on the grass next to the sidewalk. It was half a fairy ring, something I didn't see very often. I immediately stopped the car to take a picture. On the left side, the mushrooms formed an almost perfect circle, but the right was cut off entirely by the road. I looked up at the trees around me, hoping to catch a glimpse of the fair folk. No such luck. It wasn't until I got home that I realized something was off. I always wore a cross my abuelita gave me years ago. The hook that kept it linked to the silver chain had a nasty habit of getting caught in something or just breaking off. And when I reached for my cross, it was gone. The hook was broken again, and I knew it must have fallen off when I stopped to look at the fairy ring. For an entire week, I went without wearing it, feeling naked without it. One day, the power went out in my house, so I walked toward the local park for some fresh air. It was there I noticed a rabbit moving in the nearby bushes. It was a very big rabbit. I assumed it was male, with brownish gray fur. It stared at me, and animal lover that I am, I wanted to get a closer look at it and maybe pet it. The rabbit stayed still as I moved closer, and I started to notice some weird details about its fur. It appeared to have some kind of markings on it, almost Art Nouveau style. The rabbit didn't shy away from me, and I reached out to pet it. But then I stopped. Something inside of me was screaming not to touch it, even though the temptation was right there. I studied the rabbit's fur patterns, and then I noticed its eyes. They were black like the eyes of a typical rabbit, but the more I looked, the more they started to change. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, and even wiped my glasses. Its eyes had turned a bright blue, almost human-like. I was paralyzed, and reality started to become fuzzy. The rabbit was still as stone, and for a split second, I thought I was looking at a lawn ornament instead of a real animal. Something clicked in my mind. A word popped into my head, and I said it out loud. Puka? The rabbit's eyes became black again, and the patterns on its fur seemed to disappear before my eyes. Then it jerked backward and hopped away. I went after it, but was blocked by the wired fence that divided the park from the other side of the neighborhood. I tried looking for the hole from which the rabbit could have escaped, but there was none. The fence was untouched, brand new, in fact. I felt dizzy, like I was going to faint. I recited the Lord's Prayer in my head, and the world became clear again. As I started heading back home, regaining my senses, I suddenly felt something inside my shoe. It wasn't a rock, and the shape I recognized all too well. I sat down and removed my shoe, and inside I found the cross I had lost the week before. I couldn't believe my eyes. I felt like crying. The hook on the cross, which had come off and was still connected to the old chain, had been fixed. And from that day onward, no matter what happened, my cross never fell off again. I tried telling my mother and a few of my friends the story, and they all unanimously agreed that it was either a fairy or a guardian angel. I still have a lot of questions, like Why did the puka run off once I realized its identity? Why was I hesitant to touch it? Would it have harmed me if I did? Did it have anything to do with how my cross suddenly appeared inside my shoe? Did I mess with something I shouldn't have? I don't know if I'll ever have a clear answer to these questions, seeing as I never saw the rabbit again. What I do know is that somehow, someway, that fairy brought something back I had lost. So maybe my wishful thinking wasn't too far-fetched. Maybe there really are fairies out there who are looking out for God's children. Whether I'm right or wrong, all I know is that it was an experience I will never forget, because the evidence is still around my neck to this day. When I was about 13, I kept leaving little treats in the woodland by my house on my walks through the woods. Bits of sequin, some chocolates, sweets, that kind of thing. One day, I started getting little gifts in return. A tea light, bits of ribbon, polished rocks, bones, etc. I never touched them as the sight of them always made me feel uneasy. I don't know why. But then over time, odd things started to happen around my home that were unexplainable. Shadows that didn't make sense, objects moving, food missing, and inexplicable sounds and movements. Soon I began dreaming about fairies. Not the traditional cute little ones, but scary, chilling ones. I also continued to walk through the woodlands at this time, but now it started to feel like I was being watched. And from the corner of my eye, I would see things. Dark, hairless creatures with long, skinny limbs. Goblins, maybe? But when I turned around, there was nothing there. When I told grown-ups about these experiences, they got quite concerned, and I was shipped off to a therapist who said I was suffering from paranoia and a fantasy-prone personality. I was prescribed medication, which I've been on ever since, and since being on the medication, I haven't seen a thing. But I still feel at times as if there is something watching and waiting when I'm out in the woodlands. Sometimes it's like there's something standing so close to me, I can feel its breath on my face or neck. And again, sometimes, if I'm particularly distraught, for example, I get a flicker of something in my peripheral vision. I wish I could say these experiences were pleasant, but they never were. Whenever they were happening, I would feel a sense of dread or uneasiness. Why do I think I was encountering fairies? I don't know, it's just a feeling. I think fairies are a race of magical beings that live alongside us. As a young teenager, I was sat in bed one evening reading Shakespeare's The Tempest. I was wide awake. I would usually read for hours before going to sleep. There's a legend about The Tempest. It's said that when it is read, fairies will appear. I was thinking about this and scoffing to myself about what a load of rubbish it was, and theorizing that it was probably just a publicity device dreamed up by Shakespeare to promote his play, when, very suddenly, I felt as though someone or something was looking over my left shoulder. I turned my head very quickly and instinctively in time to see a burst of sparkly, twinkling lights. Quite small, about the size of my hand, just behind and above my shoulder. It was sort of like the sparkles given out by a bonfire night sparkler. But the strange thing was, it was as though the firework or light was imploding rather than exploding in the normal way of things. Then there was nothing. I got the strongest sense that the fairy had been caught out and vanished just in time. After that day, the whole family, 2 adults and 4 teenagers/children, had continually and regularly experienced bizarre and at times disturbing activity. Example, rapping on the first floor bedroom windows at night, apparitions, poltergeist activity, voices. Once I woke up because I'd been disturbed by a host of voices chatting and laughing. It was as though I'd woken in the middle of a dinner party. In the living room, I once looked in the mirror and saw my face change into several other people, and then I vanished completely. I turned and looked behind me. When I looked back, I still couldn't see myself in the mirror for several seconds. Something about that place became otherworldly, I suppose. Maybe I shouldn't have doubted the story about the Tempest. Whatever the explanation for all this, the memory of what happened that night and the events that followed are as clear to me now as when they happened over 20 years ago. I don't know what fairies are. Interdimensional beings with a strong sense of mischief, I guess. I don't know what else to say about them. Only that the activity started after I doubted them. And maybe they found some kind of satisfaction in proving me wrong. Thanks for watching, and thanks to all those who submitted their stories. We just reached a pretty cool milestone on the channel, 40,000 subscribers, and I just want to welcome the new subscribers to the channel and acknowledge all the subscribers who've been with the channel for years. You are the reason I keep making these videos, so thank you guys so much for being here. And for all your support, it really means the world. Another milestone recently is that my fantasy novel, The Ghost of Nothing, turned a year old. And I just want to thank all those who took a chance on the book, left me a review, or sent me a personal message about the book through my website or email. I really appreciate all the kind words, all the great things you've been saying. It's extremely motivating, and I'm currently hard at work on the sequel. If you haven't read The Ghost of Nothing, it's a fairy fantasy inspired by the kinds of fairy stories I read on this channel and traditional fairy folklore. It's spooky, Tim Burton-esque fairy tale, and it's available as an ebook, paperback, hardcover, and an audio. All the links are in the description. I'm going to be reflecting more on everything I've learned in my first year as a published writer on my writing newsletter, The Shaken Tree. So if you're interested in that, be sure to head over to my writing website and subscribe. All the links are below. If you have a true fairy encounter story to share, you can check out the channel's website at scaryfairygodmother.com. That link is also in the description. Everything's in the description. The website has a spot where you can submit your stories, comments, questions, and suggestions. And you can also sign up for the mailing list dedicated to the channel, Fairy Lights, where I talk all things fairy. You can also head over to my writing website. Everything about my writing and the fairy world I've developed in the books will be discussed there and on my writing newsletter. As always, I want to send out my heartfelt thanks to all of my supporters on Patreon and to anyone who joined the channel or made a one-time donation through PayPal or Ko-fi, or who became a paid member of one of my newsletters. I appreciate you guys so much and the support you are giving this work. If you like this channel and the stories I tell here and would like to lend your support, please check out my Patreon page and the other support options in the description. I've started to upload versions of my videos that are ad-free, stories only, no intro or outro for channel members and Patreon members, so if that's something you're interested in, please consider becoming a member. Please leave a comment below. Tell me what you thought about these stories, and like, share, and subscribe if you're new. It really helps the channel when you do that. And hit the bell to receive notifications of new videos. And until next time, this has been a visit from your scary fairy godmother.